Okay. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Pedophile Huntress. We're here with a common goal that you be encouraged in heart and united in love. Tonight, I have a new guest with me. I'll just call her Klara. Klara reached out on my break and sent a very heartfelt message. And I wanted to share just the very opening paragraph that she sent because it is just really packed with things that I know will resonate with each heart that's listening. And this is how she began her email. I'm resonating with so much of what you, Emily, and Carol have been discussing. And I'm so grateful that you're putting into words the similarities in our experiences. My journey started at 24, 18 years ago. I was newly married, a new sense of safety, and working full time. Until this point, I wholeheartedly believed I had a great family and a perfect childhood. A big red flag, right? One day, I was home by myself watching TV, and the walls began to cave in on me. I got scared and went upstairs to sleep. The next day, I went to work and I had a panic attack, which was the beginning of my struggle with anxiety. Anxiety eventually landed me in a therapist's office, and I talked mostly about my mother, who was controlling and emotionally abusive for the better part of the next following 10 years. Soon after I began therapy, I also started taking antidepressants, which resulted in cutting off enough emotions to be functional. During those years of therapy, there was one instance triggered by a hand motion that led to what my therapist called a psychotic episode, during which I uncovered two memories and was certain that I had been sexually abused by my father. My therapist basically didn't want to go there with me, and we dismissed it. All right. So, Clara, thank you so much for your email. There's a lot more to her email, but I'm going to let Clara take the story from here. And if you would just bring us into the context of your family environment, and let's start with your life from 0 to 7. Why don't we start there?
Yes, hi Jody. Thank you so much for having me on your show. It's really an honor to be here. Yeah, I wanted to start with an idea that I think a lot of your listeners will be able to relate to, and that's the idea of expansion and collapse. In my adult life, like you mentioned in your intro, I experienced several moments of collapse that were preceded by a personal expansion or growing out of my family of origin. And I think that I resonated with your podcast so well because you do such a great job giving space for the pain and also the beauty in our stories, the vulnerability and the resilience. And I what I have lived is that one is not possible without the other when you come from an abusive family environment. And so I wanted to just take a little bit of time to describe that family environment for me. I was born in Hungary in the 80s. It was a communist country in Eastern Europe. And the 80s were especially hard because of poverty. But I think what was even more important is that, more significant, is that it had been a communist country for about 4 decades prior to my birth. And without going into politics too much, there was a process of dehumanization that was at its peak. You know, people lost their individuality. They lost their dreams, their hopes, their desires. They lost their dignity, their integrity, and really, what happened was the place became a breeding ground for depravity and abuse.
Mm.
Um, you know, my um, I recently found a study that explains that during the years of 1960 and 1990, so exactly the time when my parents were children and then growing up into adults, the suicide rate in Hungary was the highest in the whole world for the vast majority of those years.
Oh,
And I
wow.
and I just share this to kind of give a glimpse into the
Hmm.
environment. And I actually have personal anecdotes that support that study. I have murder suicide on both sides of my family, and pretty uh, close family. On my mother's side, my grandfather murdered my grandmother and then set their house on fire and died of smoke inhalation when I was 6 months old.
Oh, wow.
My mother at the time had a 2.5 year old, my sister, and me. And I think that this event really resulted in me never being able to bond with my mother in a healthy way. And in fact, I didn't really attach to any of my family members early on. And on my father's side, he had a cousin who was murdered by a jealous lover. She was thrown into a well, and then he jumped in front of a moving train, which
Oh,
was a
man.
pretty common way to commit suicide at the time. And so my father was an only child. He grew up on a farm, pretty isolated and poor in the middle of nowhere in rural Hungary. And, um, because they had a bit of land, they had some farm animals, they had some possessions, they were persecuted by the communist government. And there's a story that I've heard snippets of that I'd like to share, which is that my grandfather one time harvested a little more crops than he was allowed to. And he was reported to the authorities by a neighbor. And the authorities came and arrested him and took him to court. Um, and my father was a boy at the time. And I think as he watched his father being taken away, um, and he and his mother were left behind, and his mother was already experiencing some pretty significant mental health issues. I think he just had this sense of powerlessness and lack of control over the deterioration of his family. And I think this environment really twisted him, and I think his psyche was pretty damaged in this scenario. So when my parents get together, they start out as an affair, and they um, their dynamic actually reminds me of Carol Boyce's parents' dynamics in the sense that my mother was like the obviously abusive one. She was verbally abusive, emotionally abusive. She also hit us. And my father kind of skated by. He was more quiet, and he was largely an absent figure. He never stopped having affairs right away in their marriage. I think my mother realized that he just had an urge that she couldn't satisfy, and I think she accepted it. And in a weird way, she kind of became more of a mother to him than a wife.
Mm.
And at the same time, my mother, because of the family tragedy that happened to her parents, and just being in this situation of not being supported, not having resources, not really being able to trust, um, you know, even her family members, she just became a person who could not contain her emotions. And socially, publicly, she was a pretty successful teacher and mother. She held us on a tight leash and had us, we had no choice but to have straight A's and excel in all of our activities. And she had us competing in competitions. But when we were the three of us at home, she had a lot of rage. And I think my sister and I suffered the consequences of that. So my first few years of life, the way I would characterize my experience is I was in a state of frozenness. I was in a frozen state, dissociated for most of the time. And it was in the context of the political situation. One story that I think is a good metaphor is when I was going to daycare, um, the way that people dropped off their kids was they were required to take off all of the kids' clothes and hand the children over to daycare workers
Oh
completely
my
naked
gosh.
through a window. The parents couldn't even go inside. They handed the kids over through a window. And I think it's just a metaphor of we're going to completely strip you of all of your individuality. And now you
Oh,
become,
that's stronger than a metaphor. That's reality.
yeah, yeah.
Wow.
And
Wow. And these are your years 0 to 7.
these are, yes, 0 to 7.
Wow. Clara. Wow.
So I started with, a lot of trauma right away. And all I know, fortunately, I don't have many memories of that daycare. But my daycare teachers were very harsh. They were never smiling, never encouraging. Happiness was not a thing when I was growing up. They were themselves quite traumatized and stuck. And so, now that I have kids, I have three beautiful children. I know that normal childlike
Mhm.
behavior includes being loud, running around, movement, giggling, conflicts, crying,
Mhm.
experimenting with boundaries, with relationships. That's how you learn. Well, my
Mhm.
peers and I didn't do any of that. We weren't allowed to really connect with each other or with the adults. We weren't able to have role models, or really experience any positivity coming from the daycare teachers and or anyone in our community. And we became, obedient little communist kids who were just frozen. And we learned to stand in line and uh, be guided from point A to point B, not ask questions, not even look our authority in the face. And I think that this wasn't just daycare. I grew up without real role models or people with integrity around me. So not only were my parents not really capable of being good parents, but I didn't experience, um, the support or kindness from adults, from any of the adults in the community. And the way that I got out of, well, another quick story. When I was 7, I had to have my tonsils out. My parents took me to the hospital, and you can kind of imagine the hospital room. Um, it was, for several patients divided by curtains. And I just was going to have kind of like a simple bed and a side table with a bowl to throw up in. And I was going to spend the day and the night there by myself. And I remember a feeling of freedom as I walked into the room.
Wow.
And my mom said when it was time for them to go, she said, "Do you want to walk us out?" And I said, "No, I don't. I wanted to have my space. I was happy
Mhm.
to have that space to myself." And now that I have a 7-year-old, it's quite incomprehensible that he would, you know,
Right. Right.
react the way that
Right.
I
Find
did.
right. Find solace in this frightening surgery.
Yes,
Right. But right. I mean, there was peace from the chaos for a minute.
yes. And
Wow.
right around, 8 or 9 years old, I um, started to um, get out of this frozen state, this dissociation. And what helped me was the discovery of basketball. I um, from the first moment, I think I just absolutely fell in love with the movement, with the teamwork, with being able to connect with my
Mm.
peers, the collaboration. It was in a reduced way, on the basketball court, but it was just intoxicating to me. And as I gained more and more agency, I realized that I could use my legs to walk me away, to run me away from my family and my community. And that's when I started running, really. I became very, very focused. I was obsessed with basketball. I would sleep with a basketball, I would dribble the
Mm,
basketball on the
right.
street. And I just kept myself very, very active. By the time I was in seventh grade, I spent almost half of my days away from my town and playing for this better basketball team in the city. And by the time I was in high school, I moved away to go to a different high school, and I lived in a dorm. And I thrived when I was the further I was from my family, the more success I had. I had quite a bit of success in basketball. I was a good student. I got good grades. I was very focused. And fast forward to after sophomore year, so I'm 16, and by sheer luck or maybe the spirit that was guiding me, I have an opportunity to go to the United States for a year as an international student. And I jump on the opportunity. I don't think twice about it. I arrive in the US and I go to school. I was going to be an au pair and stay with a host family. And right away, I this is my first big moment of expansion. I look around me and I see people smiling, positive, supportive, encouraging. I see girls who are cherished for their
Mm,
qualities.
right. This is a
Um,
brand new experience.
it's a brand new
All
experience.
right. And I bet you feel like you're 42 at 16, really,
Mhm.
right? Much
Yes,
older than you are because of your
yes,
experiences.
yes. And I, I just see that girls have a concept of themselves that
Mm,
is that they are worthy, that they are worthy, and they are cherished by their families. And I decide that I'm going to be one of these girls. I'm going to fake it until I make it. I am going to just be like this, and I attempt to cut off my past. Um, and by the end of that year, I know that there's no way back for me, and I'm going to do everything I can to stay in the US. And with the help of my host family, I managed to go to college. I meet my husband at 19. He was also an international student.
mm,
And a few years after that, because of his talent and hard work, he obtains the green card and the citizenship. And we got married at 22. And so, we start our adult life. Um, and I have this beginning to my relationship that is beyond my wildest dreams, right? I'm in the United States, married to a great guy. I have a job. We're working.
mm,
And right away, I start having lots of problems and I start struggling with our relationship. And the way I see it now, um, my relationships growing up were so intense. There was such an intensity to them, such
mm,
secrecy to
mm,
them, that the the calmness, the peace, I didn't understand. There was something lacking for me. Once, the passion was not the only thing in our relationship, and we had to work and be responsible. I really struggled, and that um, that's when anxiety begins for me. You read in the intro that I was just, it came out of left field. I really felt that the walls were going to bury me.
Mhm. Because we
And
believe we do. We all, I think I got married at 17, and Clara, I felt too, this was a brand new start for me. However, I just woke up in somebody else's prison. So I understand. Continue.
yeah, well, so in my therapist's office, like you mentioned, I spoke more about my mother. And then I had that
Mhm.
episode of, it was a trigger. I was triggered by a hand gesture. And I ran away for 3 days. I was walking around in a park and I was in such obvious distress. It was written all over my face. People came up to me and said, Miss, we can see that you're going
Mm,
through something. Is there anything we can do to help you? And I was basically in an altered state of consciousness. And I had these two memories emerge, and I share them because they are explicit memories. I have lots of implicit memories too, but I don't talk about them publicly. I wanted to share these two because they are memories that were always in my brain, somewhere in my brain, buried. And once in that state that I was, the cover was gone. Whatever wall was
mhm,
protecting them, um, and not allowing me access to them was gone. And so one memory was, and so this was from the time when I was about 10 or 11. And one memory was of molestation, and the other one was physical assault. And so I came back to my therapist and said, I think I was sexually abused by my father. And I also shared some other things, like in my teenage years, I had a, a, a moment when he came and kissed me on the lips. And it
mhm,
was followed by, activation in my body, my heart rate accelerating.
mhm,
Um, and he just walked into the room, kissed me on the lips, and walked out. Another time, he touched my breast, and same thing, extreme activation. Um, he also had this habit of walking around with holding my hand and pretending that I was his girlfriend. And I just remembered the shame and the embarrassment that I felt while he was doing this. And just generally also feeling that he had some jealousy when I started having boyfriends, and even
mhm.
before my wedding, he engaged in some very bizarre behaviors that make me think that he was trying to ruin our wedding. My father also had the habit of writing down his thoughts, his reflections into notebooks. And I found a couple of my um, childhood diaries that he used to fill in with his thoughts. And um, he himself writes about a sex addiction that he had, that he could not control. And
In your
what comes,
diary.
yes,
Yeah. Aren't they lovely
yes,
people?
yes, this is a
Wow.
huge invasion, right?
Right.
Into my privacy. And this is why I took these two notebooks back, because they were mine and he
Mm.
used them for these reflections. And so what comes out clearly from those is that he felt a sense of power and control in in abuse, in abusing young children, and in his sex addiction. Um, but coincidences in life. My therapist at the time was going through a divorce, and like I said, he was very comfortable talking about my abusive mother, and not so comfortable talking about my father. He was a bit of a father figure by this point to me. And he, I'm sure he said many things that, but the one thing that stuck with me was he said, when daughters become teenagers, fathers just spend a lot of time in the garage.
Oh, your
And I'm,
therapist said this.
yes, yes.
Interesting.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to interpret that, but it kind of confirmed my experience that men, some men, many men, all men, I'm not sure, have this urge, sexual urge
Well,
that
it
can't
sounds
be
like that
controlled.
therapist did. I can't, I'm not going to wrap up all men in that. I don't think all men have that. But again, you just bring up so many incredibly important things, which the one that we're talking about right now is find a good therapist. And if it's not a good therapist, it's not a good therapist. Yeah. How long did you stay with him then after that statement?
A very long time, total 10 years.
Oh, wow.
So about another 5 years after that. And I'm glad that's exactly why I share this, because it's so important to work with a
So
therapist,
important.
yeah,
That
that
knows
is
what they're
able to,
doing.
that knows what they're doing
Hmm.
exactly.
And
And
there are
and
a
I
lot of
don't,
therapists, you're right, that are not comfortable with that. I've shared in the past that I had a therapist that actually kind of fired me. And she said, Jody, I'm going to send you to the man who mentored me because you have huge guy issues. And I did. And I wasn't offended. I think therapists, if you're listening, if you are over your head, kindly send these people that have come through these severe childhood traumas to somebody else that knows what they're doing. Right, Klara?
yes, absolutely. And just to clarify, I also don't believe it's all men for sure. I had the good fortune of having lots of very decent men around me in my life with great integrity. But at the time, it just
Yes. No, I
confirmed a
get it.
belief that
Mhm.
I had absorbed growing up.
Well,
So we
yeah.
left it there. So we left it there.
Wow. And so unfortunately when they do that, so you're talking about being in this park and you're in a full blown PTSD. I remember those. So I don't have them as much anymore, but you have this fog. You feel like you're out of your mind. It's very hard to stay focused anywhere. And that can last for a few days. Sometimes I would leave my counselor's office in what I call that PTSD fog because memories would come back and, it feels like you're there. And how deeply sad that he didn't know how to take you beyond that. But you've said so
Yeah.
many deeply sad things today that I'm taken aback because our stories are riddled with just such depravity and so much turmoil that and I'll let you continue, but just stopping for a moment because you've said so many things that at 16 you have this hope, you come to America, you have a dream, and as long as we continue to run, those dreams are possible without going into the back. But it's not possible to carry on in life with this perpetual momentum that makes us either we begin drinking, you know what I mean, or you get into these addictions that can stop it, or you up the depression medicine or whatever, or you end up like you say in therapy at 23 because now all of a sudden life stops. It's come to a pace where you're back in the rhythm of reality.
Mhm.
And that rhythm of reality was more than you could run from. I'm curious, did your parents then come to America or did they just come for the wedding?
Our wedding was actually in Hungary.
Okay, so you went
They
back.
continued to, yes, we actually went back every year to visit.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay. I mean,
yeah,
there was a lot of questions I had, like when you say that you were passed through this window and they took your clothes off. When you went through that window, did they hand you a uniform to put on?
yes. We all had to wear the same uniform.
Wow. And I'll tell you, I know that that was a real experience, but when you talk about metaphorically, it's almost gripping the way that you explain that because just to be reduced to being naked and handed through a window, I just
Hmm.
It's intolerable as a child. Your mind cannot conceive. I mean, they rip you down to absolutely no value. And I do know that all childhood sexual abuse does the same thing to you. So I think the metaphor that you use here, um, while it's a real experience, yeah, it's just gripping to me, quite honestly, Clara,
Hmm.
because right, what you have nothing left. What you have a heartbeat going through that window. You have no respect. You have no identity at that point, really, right? As you get
That's
to the
right.
other side. And this desperately sets you up for the abuse then that you endure at the hands of your father.
That's right. It's really a the awareness that I am um, working with now is that in my vulnerability as a young child, I wasn't surrounded by people who protected me or who had the capacity um, to to love, in a healthy way. And they just didn't have that integrity that is needed to protect that vulnerability. And so if
Right.
we fast forward to when I'm 30 and I'm a new mother and my son is about 8 months old, and we went to visit my parents in Hungary in the summertime. And so did my sister. She, at that point, had a 3-year old daughter, and she was pregnant with her second child. We were all staying at my parents' house.
Mm.
And, um, suddenly I realized that my niece and my father have disappeared. And I ask around, where they are, and I'm told that they've gone to take a nap a couple of houses down on the same street, which was an empty neighbor's house that my parents were using to sleep there because we didn't have enough room. And so, naps with grandpa were not out of the ordinary. My niece was the first grandchild, and my parents were pretty involved in raising her. And for whatever reason, this time around, I wanted to go after them. And I went over to that house. I get there. I try to open the door, but it's locked. So I start knocking on it. And as I wait, I step up on this ledge and I look through a window. And at that moment, I see my niece and my father walking out of the inside room, and they are both naked. And my father was just putting on his underwear. And I'm shocked. My father opens the door and I ask him, why is the door locked? And he says, to keep strangers out. Why are you naked? Because it's hot. And I see the slyness, on his face that is very activating to me. And I look at my niece and she's naked, 3 years old, and in the company of this 65-year-old naked man. And I just at a level I understand that she's trapped and she doesn't even know it.
Mhm.
And on top of that, her mother and her grandmother are endorsing and encouraging this relationship. And that will really screw you up.
So this is after you go back and you've already had the recovered memories of, I hate calling them recovered, by the way, so I'm going to say what it is that you remembered that your
Mm-hmm.
father um, had done these sexual advances to you. Had you already had those memories when you went back on this trip?
Yes and no. I believe that when we have memories that have had been repressed for a while, I
Mhm.
think our brain works hard to override
Mhm.
them. Um, and this actually, what I'm describing to you now, was something, I was an adult. I was 30 years old, and yet my brain tried to pretend that it didn't happen. My brain tried to go back to the way things were, and it really takes um, a lot of strength to to hold your line, to really honor what you experienced, especially when you're the only one in the family who has this new emerging truth, and you're basically my family considers that I am the one whose standards have changed. I'm the one who has been going to therapy and has been filling up my head with these ideas, and it's really, it's very it's much easier for them to consider me crazy. um, but what happened next was i I led my niece back to the house, and I told my husband exactly what I saw, and he was concerned. And I told my sister what I saw, and she said, "Don't say anything to my partner." And I told my mom exactly what I saw, and she just gave me a disapproving look that I felt was both for my father and for me. And I also told a couple of in laws on my husband's side of the family that I was close to, and my therapist. And telling that story 5 times exactly the way it happened was really important. And it helped me in the subsequent years um, to realize I cannot override and I cannot push away this new reality that is emerging for me. And that same day, I took my niece out for ice cream, and she told me that grandpa touched her and had her touch his penis. And I asked her, do other men in the family on your dad's side do this? And she said, no, just grandpa. And I talked to my sister at the time, and I said, you have to be careful. You can never let them alone. Just, keep an eye. And she agreed with me. And they were living abroad at the time. So we both considered it an isolated incident. And we basically went back to our lives and we moved on. In the next few years, my husband and I had 2 more kids, and we were busy with work. And my sister had always struggled with being away from our parents. I think that she she didn't have that expansion that I had. She could never emerge as an individual outside of the family, trauma bond, really.
Mm-hmm.
And I did have that trauma bond as well. I was very aware of the hardships that my parents went through. Um, and I think this trauma bond was very strong, and was the thing that didn't allow my sister to live away from our parents. And so in the next couple of years, she decided to move back, not to the country, not to the town, but into my parents' house.
Oh, wow.
And by this
Sad.
time, she had 3 kids, two
Oh,
daughters and a
no.
son. And, I had done enough therapy to know that this was a very bad idea. And I tried to
Right.
discourage her. And my parents were very involved in the kids' lives growing
Oh,
up.
sure. Yeah.
And as these things are happening, I'm just growing further and further apart. Um, and we continue to visit, but our visits are becoming more and more stressful. And I'm having a hard time just playing the part in this charade, in this, act. I consider
Mhm.
it an act that is showing a normal family, and I just see a lot of problems.
Right. It's a great
And
way to say it.
this comes to a point when my own daughter turns 3 years old, the same age that my niece had been, that I just lose it. I am really struggling. I'm throwing up. I am paranoid. I'm not able to let the
Mm.
kids out of my sight, even with my sister. I even have like full body paralysis one night for a few minutes. And, that summer, which was 2.5 years ago, I decided that I wasn't going to go to this goodbye dinner, which we always did before our departure. And instead, I gathered my mom and my dad and my sister in their kitchen. And I had written up a couple paragraphs, and I told them that I was basically detaching from the family emotionally and spiritually, that I could no longer be a part of this act.
Oh, that's
And
huge.
it was huge. And I told them, you know, if and when someone's ready to talk about these bigger discussions, and I was specific, about the relationship between our father and my niece, and some of the other dynamics, among the family members, that my door was open. And Jody, what's interesting is I was so kind and peaceful. I told them I have no ill will toward anybody. I wish
Mhm.
everybody the best. I just want to be free from this. And, you know, as I'm telling you this whole story, you probably noticed also that it's a monotone. There's not much emotion accompanying these events. And that's really, I am able to see it now, that my kindness and my peace towards this whole process was preventing me from fully um, accepting the reality that my my family was abusive in more than one way. um, and
I'm
it
cu-
I could go ahead.
I'm curious before you move on, how did your parents, and I also went to my family years and years ago in my 20s and tried to be incredibly kind. And, my mom would say things like, I know you're trying to help us all. And nothing ever changed, but I also was very kind about it. And so I'm curious, how did your parents and your sister in that kitchen, when you're sharing this, what did they share back with you?
My sister was the only one who tried to engage in a conversation. My mother actually had um, a, an expression on her face that was relief. That I wasn't going to make a big fuss, that I was
Mm,
just going to exit the family and let them be. Um, which is, it's very painful, obviously.
right.
But that summer, I really uh, had detached from my parents, and like I mentioned earlier, I think that there was a lack of attachment from the get go. But my sister was difficult to detach from, because detaching from my sister also meant detaching from my nieces and my nephew, and
Right.
this continues to be a big
That's
struggle for me.
heartbreaking. Yes, it's heartbreaking to leave those that you love.
Yeah, yeah. And
Wow.
I
That's
continued, and incredibly, I continued to, while my contact with them was marginal, I would, every year for my dad's birthday, which is in September, I would send him this message of, I wish you good health, I wish you peace, I wish you happiness. And he would never respond or send me anything for my birthday. And isn't that interesting, Jody, that we
well,
just
I
continue
taught,
to.
yeah, well, though, and if you ask yourself the question, how heartfelt is this when you get into real emotions? And I appreciate that your telling of the story tonight can be in a monotone tone, as you say, because you've walked through it, you've lived it, and it's better than walking around with these gaping wounds. And so I understand that. And his rejection of you is really more grooming. I think that in our childhood, they used the tool of rejection as the strongest weapon against us for us to comply with their demands. If we were not good girls, if we did not do as they asked, you know what we got as a child? Rejection. And I bet that rejection still can trigger you today. His lack of acknowledging anything is still part of that old grooming process. Does that make sense to you?
Yes.
Yeah. So, you know, I just have so much compassion for your story. I'm moved to emotion because it's just your story is striking, but it resembles many family stories. And people like to say to us, why didn't you call the police? Why didn't you do these things? The grooming is so intense in our families that the very act of you walking into that kitchen and gathering them together for that confrontation took more courage than most people in the world will ever understand.
Thank you for saying that. And
It's the truth. It's the
yes,
truth.
it's what I hear in all of the stories of the people on your podcast. It's a very heavy burden that we carry,
Yes.
and I hear the pain and the resilience in all of the stories on your podcast. And I just really appreciate that you create this space where we can uh, pour some of our heaviness into the empathic listener's ear, because by doing that we do lighten our load just by a little bit.
Yes.
And so having communities like this, I think, is so healing, especially because from what I have seen, as a commonality, um, carrying a heavy burden makes us heavy,
Oh, it
heavy
makes us sick. It
people.
makes us tired. It makes us stressed out. It makes us not
And
the best parents or spouses, right?
that's exactly what I was going to say, that I have struggled, at times to be a good parent, to be a good spouse, to be a good friend, coworker. And I am now in a moment of collapse where I I actually ended up trying a pretty unconventional therapy approach, and it was successful. It allowed me to have a pretty cathartic release. It was almost like a cork popping out of a bottle, um, and I have been just dealing with the contents of the bottle that are pouring out, and I am experiencing lots of emotions. And in this process, I have lost a lot of functionality. I'm actually taking some time off work, which I think has been very important for me to shed these layers of trying to be a person that was cutting out parts of myself that carried these burdens. And so now I'm in the process of feeling these emotions and trying to integrate this very heavy, heavy burden, heavy past, and figuring out how to move forward. And I can say that I am, for the first time, I am feeling like I'm turning the corner. I am able to face, my deficiencies that are resulting from my past. I'm able to have better relationships. I am less triggered. It's almost like, little bubbles are popping, in somatically in your body, and
Mm-hmm.
you just become more serene, more able to focus on what matters. And for me, that what matters the most is my relationships with my family, my husband, my kids.
Yes.
And really, what I've realized, Jody, is that um, as difficult as it is to detach from a trauma bond, it is more important for me to improve the lives of my kids, to provide their well being, and to try not to perpetuate the multi generational trauma
Yes.
that is my family of origin.
100%. One of the things that I like to say, and I really believe I met an angel once that changed my life, and he said he wrote down on a piece of paper, Jody, you see you. And Klara, I had never seen myself. I didn't see myself as worthy. I didn't see myself as valuable. So one of the people you forgot to mention is yourself in this equation. And God is always looking for us because what is happening with those bubbles, each bubble that pops, you get back your authentic self. And your authentic self has this story interwoven through it, tragedy, but it also has interwoven joy and the birth of children. And it has all of these beautiful parts that we get to make this quilt of life with. And I'm moved to tears because I want to thank you for sharing your deep tragedies that you've been through. And I also appreciate all the joys that you've shared because it becomes the quilt of our life. But what I hear you saying is that you're stepping into the reality of who you are. And that's the most important thing. When we do that, everybody around us actually becomes better as a result of us seeing ourselves. And
That's exactly it.
I really want to thank you for your authentic, um, your story is incredibly moving. There's so much to your story that I know that we're coming up on time, but I want to ask you if you would come back next month with me and do a part two of your story. I'd like you to continue this path that you're on. And there was just so much that you said that I know our listeners are going to resonate with. And I've got to forgive me. Yeah, I'm moved to just so much compassion for you. But I also feel like you're on this beautiful, beautiful path, the path of redemption that leads you to the healing that you need to be on. And we like to say that our parents didn't have enough love or the right love for what we needed. I'm really hard pressed to not say, I don't see love there at all. And when we actually start seeing these families for what they are, a tragic loss and devastation of what they continue to take if we stay in them, we begin to find that the path away from them is much easier because we're leaving all that tragedy and pain behind. Of course, we have to walk through it, but those trauma bonds are incredibly. I've lost my entire family, all my siblings. My A few nephews and nieces have reached out to me in the past years because of course they're all in their 20s and 30s, and I'm so thankful for that. But I've lost a lot of people as a result of that because my children, unfortunately, in the very early years were around my father. So I want to share that that tragedy continued in my family as well until I stood up finally in my 30s and said, I can't do this anymore. And like you, I only could do it in the beginning for the love of my children. And I almost lost them as a result of not being able to be courageous and standing up. And so the voices that we're bringing tonight are for our children first, but also for ourselves. Because if we don't continue to fight this battle for ourselves, right, Klara, then we won't continue to find the strength that we need. And for me, I run to a heavenly father that takes care of me quite strongly. But I guess I just wanted to stop and just wrap you with a ton of love because it's so courageous for you to come on and share everything that you've shared. And I hope that you'll be willing to meet with me again next month and continue this story because there's just so much that you said. I mean,
Yes.
I was taken aback that I wanted to listen. I'm sure like the listener did. And so you be thinking about things, listeners. If you have questions, certainly email me at my email. Everybody knows where to find my email. But Klara, is there anything that I hope to leave you in a good space tonight, wrap you in a lot of warmth and love and just godly attention as you go on with your week? But is there anything that you would like to, in these closing moments, that you would like to share that maybe you feel like you haven't, or just kind of wrapping it up in this part one with you?
Yeah, Jody, I would be honored to come back and just wanted
Wonderful.
to say that you have created a space where many people have been able to step into their stories, and I'm just so honored to be one of these people.
Thank you.
It's very very healing to me to have my name published along with my story, and to move forward with the entirety of my story. And
Yes.
so I just want to really thank you and let you know that I really admire your courage and the work that you do. And um, I'm just incredibly grateful to have found your podcast and this space. So
Thank
thank you
you.
for having me.
Oh, 100%. So I want to end it with tonight. Clara's beautiful words in her email were this: sending all of you lots of love, and please keep doing what you do. You're saving many lives by your work. Thank you, Clara, for that. And we'll be bringing you part two. If you would please support this work by just subscribing to the podcast, it helps out here. I would deeply appreciate it. And we'll see you on the next episode of The Pedophile Huntress. Thank you, Clara. Be blessed, and extra protection to you this week.
Thank you, Joni.
Good night.
Bye bye.